The heat had Madrid in its grip. The summer afternoons of 1680 were so stifling that even the thick stone walls of the Alcazar could not hold back the swelter. Inside its gilded halls, the air seemed frozen in place, heavy, stagnant, and laced with an unspoken scent. It was not the fragrance one expected in a royal palace. It was neither the perfume of roses nor the sweetness of jasmine. It was something else entirely, a shadow in the air that turned the grandeur of the palace into a hushed, uneasy silence. Whenever she walked down the corridor, the servants lowered their eyes. Some held their breath. Others dabbed perfume onto their handkerchiefs and covered their noses. And always, that same hushed whisper, "Her Royal Highness is coming." A single sentence, heavy with both reverence and fear. 19-year-old Princess Margarita Teresa, daughter of King Philip IV of Spain, and niece to her own mother. Her brow carried the dignity of royal rank, but her body was a prisoner to a hidden punishment that no medicine, no fragrance, no prayer could disguise. A constant, deep stench of rot and dampness, as if the door to the grave had opened before its time. This smell was no secret. It was a symbol, a sign of a kingdom that had poisoned itself in the name of keeping its bloodline pure. Centuries of marriages between close kin, an obsession with preserving power, and now each generation was weaker, sicker, more broken than the one before. In the corner of the grandest room, the court painter Diego Velázquez watched her in silence. For years, he had captured the faces of this family on canvas, faces where royal grandeur was etched alongside the growing lines of genetic decay. And in that moment, he knew the princess's stench was not merely an illness of the body. It was the scent of a dynasty dying, slowly losing its breath. Mornings in the royal palace carried a beauty of their own. The marble floors gleamed as if polished with silver brushes. Slender rays of sunlight streamed through towering windows, and far away, the soft chime of the palace bells drifted through the air. But in Princess Margarita's world, these were only a curtain drawn over a truth she could never truly hide. Her mornings always began the same way. The maids would slip silently into her chamber, hands full with bottles of perfume and bowls of fragrant water. The first task was to open the windows, to let in the fresh morning air. But even that air would not linger for long. It was as if the scent had seeped into the very walls themselves. Margarita would sit quietly before the mirror. On her face rested the unmistakable marks of royal blood. An elegant high nose, the strong, broad jawline, features that bore the stamp of the Habsburg lineage. A maid would gently dab her skin with scented water, then mist her gown with the finest perfume. But the perfume's strength was fleeting. Among the palace servants, an unspoken habit had taken root. When they approached the princess, they would draw in a breath and hold it. No one ever said a word, but there was always that brief flicker in the eyes. A faint hesitation, a moment's restraint. Margarita had seen it since childhood, had felt it in the air around her, yet she never let it show. Today was different. Today, the French ambassador was to be received at court, and the princess was to be present for the occasion. Her gown had been prepared, white silk threaded with gold, embroidered with rare pearls. Around her neck, a diamond necklace. At her ears, long emerald drops. There was no lack of splendor. Yet, as Margarita stood before the mirror, her eyes carried the same old question. Could all this gold and brilliance truly hide what lay beneath? The midday sun spread a shifting tapestry of light and shadow across the palace courtyard. Royal guards stood in two perfect lines on either side of the great doors, their gilded armor catching the sunlight so sharply it almost blinded the eye. From beyond the gates came the measured rhythm of hooves and the low, rolling rumble of carriage wheels drawing closer. Inside, the royal reception hall stood in perfect readiness. Everyone was in position, each breath held, as if a delicate moment was about to unfold. The air was rich with the mingled scent of rosewater and burning incense, yet beneath it all lingered another fragrance, one unspoken but deeply felt by all. The great door swung open. The French ambassador, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, entered, a tall man with a keen, calculating gaze. His eyes seemed to take in everything at once. The marble columns, the velvet drapes, and above all, the faces. Faces in which Spain's grandeur and decline lived side by side. Princess Margarita advanced with regal composure, the hem of her gown gliding over the marble like flowing silk. Her face held the same practiced royal smile, the product of years of courtly discipline. Yet, as she drew near, the faintest, almost imperceptible flicker crossed the ambassador's expression, a subtle tightening near his nose, an involuntary reaction he could not hide. Margarita felt it instantly, as if a needle had been driven into her heart, but she did not falter. With a graceful bow, she welcomed him. "You are most welcome, Marquis de Torcy." Her voice was soft, yet steady. The ambassador inclined his head in respect, but in his eyes burned that same sharp, appraising glint. He knew this was more than a ceremonial greeting. It was an inspection, one whose observations would travel swiftly back to the court of King Louis XIV. For a few moments, everything seemed to proceed as planned, until suddenly, the princess's face turned pale. Her steps wavered, her hand trembled slightly. A lady-in-waiting rushed forward to steady her, but before anyone could react, Margarita closed her eyes and sank gently to the floor. A heavy silence fell over the hall. Only the curling smoke of incense remained, and the faint whisper of silk against marble. In the great hall of the palace, it was as though time itself had stopped. All eyes were fixed on the princess, lying motionless upon the marble floor. The maids rushed forward in a flurry of silk, gathering the folds of her costly gown as they tried to lift her. One sprinkled cool water across her brow, another uncorked a vial of perfume and held it close to her nose. But Margarita's eyelids remained shut. From the shadows at the edge of the room, a royal messenger suddenly darted away. His footsteps echoed through the deep corridors of the palace until he reached the private chambers of King Philip IV. The door swung open, and the messenger bowed low. "Your Majesty, the princess has fainted." For a long moment, the king said nothing. In his hand was a quill, poised above a half-written letter, now laid aside on the desk. In his eyes lay a shadow of weariness, one not born merely from years of war, politics, and the burdens of empire. It was a weight heavier than statecraft, the unspoken grief of watching his own children grow weak and ill. Slowly, Philip rose to his feet and began the long walk toward his daughter's chambers. The corridors glowed with golden light, but within his heart there was only a cold darkness. With every step, one thought grew sharper. Was it I who brought my children to this fate? Memories struck him like sudden lightning. His marriage to his niece, Queen Mariana of Austria, sealed according to the old family custom of keeping the blood pure. At the time, it had seemed a political triumph. Now, it felt like a silent killer, dripping poison into his children's veins with every heartbeat. When he reached the chamber, Margarita lay upon a bed of soft velvet. The maids stood quietly around her, and the air was heavy with rosewater, incense, and a faint dampness that clung like a shadow. The king stepped closer and touched his daughter's forehead. Her skin was cool and moist, like dew upon a fragile flower. Yet this was no freshness, only a sign of fragility. "Daughter, open your eyes," Philip murmured. Margarita's lashes trembled before lifting slowly. She looked at her father, and in her gaze there was both shame and sorrow, as though she knew she herself was a living emblem of her family's decline. In another wing of the palace, where even the sunlight filtering through the windows seemed dimmer and cooler, Prince Carlos II of Spain, the young heir to the throne, sat before a large wooden desk. He was only 12 years old, yet his face already bore lines of exhaustion and frailty. Before him lay an open book, its pages filled with large, bold letters, but the words seemed to slip from his eyes and vanish somewhere beyond his grasp. His tutor, a thin man with ink stains on his worn sleeves, repeated the words patiently. "My prince, try to read this." Carlos's lips moved, but the sound that emerged was faint and unclear. His enlarged jaw and overly large tongue had always made speech a struggle. Often the words would falter midway, leaving a flicker of silent frustration in his eyes. Sometimes his gaze would drift toward the window, toward the gardens where the court children ran, laughing and playing, their movements full of strength and life. They were free, vibrant, untouched by weakness. Carlos had never dared to join them. His legs were bowed, every step brought pain, and even a simple cold could confine him to bed for days. His mother, Queen Mariana, hovered over him like a constant shadow. She knew her son was the kingdom's final hope for the future of the Habsburg line, but she also knew that this hope was as fragile as glass, liable to shatter at the slightest touch. Within the palace, servants and courtiers alike understood the truth. The prince was weak. Yet it was a truth never spoken aloud, for to say it would be to commit a kind of treason. The royal blood is perfect. The phrase was less a statement than a veil, one carefully drawn over reality. But veils do not last forever, and the silent pillars of the palace seemed to know that when this one finally fell, the very foundations of Spain's empire would tremble. Evening was settling over the palace. Along the long corridors, rows of candles had been lit, their golden light flickering against the cold stone walls. King Philip IV stepped into the chamber of the royal council, where a long table awaited, surrounded by Spain's most powerful ministers and advisors. The air in the room was heavy. On the walls hung grand, intricate portraits of the Habsburg kings, their painted eyes seeming to watch in silence. A reminder that this family had once ruled the most powerful empire in Europe. The Prime Minister, the Duke of Medinaceli, spoke softly. "Your Majesty, Prince Carlos is growing older. We cannot delay matters of succession any longer. His marriage to a suitable princess must be arranged without delay." Philip stroked his whitening beard, his eyes lowering for a moment. He knew well that his son's body and health were far from ready for such a burden. The royal physicians had already told him, with careful and deliberate words, Carlos might never be able to produce an heir. But such words could not be spoken aloud, not even by the king himself. "We will look to the royal houses of France, Austria, and Portugal," he said, his voice steady with regal authority, though beneath it trembled something far more human. "Bring me the finest candidates." Pens scratched quietly as notes were taken, but every man at that table knew the truth. This marriage would be more of a gamble than a political triumph. And to lose this gamble would mean more than the end of a dynasty. It would mean the slow unraveling of the entire Spanish Empire. Just then, a courtier hurried into the room, bowing deeply before speaking. "Your Majesty, at the French ambassador's gathering, Princess Margarita has fainted." A faint murmur rippled through the chamber. Some faces hardened, others looked down at the table. No one spoke, but each understood this was not an isolated incident. It was a sign, a warning of the decline to come. The king drew in a long breath and rose slowly from his chair. "Adjourn the council," he said. "I must go to my daughter." The princess's chamber was dimly lit. Heavy velvet drapes hung over the windows, shutting out the last traces of daylight. The air was thick with the mingled scents of rosewater and smoldering herbs. In the corner, a silver bowl of warm herbal water released slow curls of steam, an invention of the royal physician meant to mask the odor that clung to the princess. Margarita lay upon a bed of soft velvet. Her skin was pale as wax, and fine beads of sweat glistened upon her brow. Nearby, two maids sat in silence, their very breathing softened, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. The door opened quietly. King Philip IV entered, the hem of his long robe whispering across the carpet. With a gesture, he dismissed the maids from the room. Seating himself beside the bed, Philip took his daughter's hand in his own. It was soft to the touch, yet so frail that the fragile bones beneath could be felt. Margarita's half-closed eyes found his, and for a fleeting instant, they held the light of her childhood, only for it to fade almost as quickly as it had appeared. "Daughter, you need your rest," Philip said gently. A faint smile touched her lips, but it did not last. "I know, Father, but sometimes I wonder, these perfumes, these jewels, can they truly fool everyone?" The king had no answer. His gaze lowered. He knew the truth. This was no mere physical ailment, but the shadow of choices, his own and those of generations before him, stretching across the centuries. "We all must bear the weight of our destiny," he said quietly. Margarita drew in a long breath, as if she were trying to press his words deep into her heart. For a moment, the chamber was utterly still, save for the faint ticking of the great clock on the wall. For centuries, Spain's royal family had stood at the very pinnacle of European power. The name Habsburg itself was synonymous with authority, splendor, and unimaginable wealth. But such greatness came at a price paid in blood. In the old order of empires, the rule was simple: keep the blood pure, keep the power within the family. Marriages between close relatives were commonplace. An uncle to his niece, a cousin to another cousin. Generation after generation, the same blood was turned in upon itself, locked within an ever-tightening circle. On the surface, the strategy appeared to work. The royal family held onto its lands and its throne. But deep within, a silent destruction was taking root, a destruction few in that age could comprehend. Years earlier, the court physician, Luis Marcato, had penned a treatise, Morbis Hereditarius, in which he warned that the children born of such unions would suffer both physical and mental frailties. But his words were dismissed as folly. Blinded by ambition and the intoxication of power, kings and queens ignored the laws of nature. And now, the consequences could be seen in the open. The infamous Habsburg jaw, so large and protruding that it made closing the mouth difficult. Skin turned sallow, eyes sunken, and that strange, inescapable odor that clung to the body of Margarita Teresa. These were not mere quirks of fate. They were the visible signs of a genetic truth. Within the palace, some still whispered of curses and witchcraft. Some claimed the princess had been struck by the evil eye. Others murmured that it was a poison sent by rival courts. But the physicians knew better. This was a sickness born of time itself, time and choices. And there was no herb, no perfume, no prayer that could undo it. It would fade only with the passing of generations. But by then, the empire itself might no longer stand. It was against this backdrop that the French ambassador had come to the palace, officially in the name of diplomacy and friendship, but in truth, to take the measure of Spain's decline. What his sharp eyes saw that day would travel straight to the court of King Louis XIV in Paris. The sands of time slipped slowly onward, and Prince Carlos II stumbled from childhood into the threshold of manhood. Yet his youth carried none of the strength, none of the vigor expected of a king. At 17, his body was still frail and delicate. His jaw protruded so far that his mouth could never fully close. His tongue was large and heavy, making speech a constant challenge, and he often needed support to walk. His legs ached endlessly, and even a mild fever could keep him confined to bed for days. Within the palace, all understood that the fate of Spain rested entirely upon this one man, and that was the greatest weakness of all. After the death of King Philip IV, Carlos had been crowned at the age of 4, but in truth, power had remained in the hands of his mother, Queen Mariana. Now, as he grew older, ministers of the crown and the great powers of Europe asked the same question. Will this king be able to continue his family's line? Queen Mariana felt the weight of that question pressing upon her heart. She had tried every remedy: powders made from rare herbs, broths from exotic beasts, even ancient superstitious rites, all in the hope of strengthening her son. But each effort ended in the same silent failure. At last, the decision was made. Carlos would marry a French princess, Marie-Louise of Orléans, celebrated for her beauty, intelligence, and royal upbringing. The grand halls of the palace were adorned with gold and velvet, and the entire court threw itself into preparations for the wedding. Yet behind all the splendor lurked a quiet fear. If this union too failed to produce an heir, the flame of the Spanish Habsburgs would be extinguished forever. On the wedding day, when Carlos appeared at the steps of the great cathedral, 2 courtiers held him steady by the shoulders. His face was pale, his eyes distant, and on his lips rested only the faintest, most fragile of smiles. The guests bowed in respect, but in more than a few eyes, the same unspoken question lingered. Could this fragile body bear the weight of the future? The royal wedding had been a spectacle of unmatched grandeur. Beneath the gilded arches of the cathedral, Marie-Louise of Orléans, the beautiful French princess, pledged herself to King Carlos II of Spain. The church bells rang out, and the great hall echoed with applause and jubilant shouts. Yet behind the glitter of ceremony, within the walls of the palace, another story was quietly unfolding. On this night, the eyes of the entire court rested on a single question: would the king be able to fulfill his most vital duty? In the tradition of the Spanish crown, the wedding night was not merely a private affair. It was a matter of state, a moment upon which the future of the empire depended. Without an heir, the Spanish throne would stand vulnerable, open to the ambitions of rival powers. In the long corridor outside the royal bedchamber, courtiers and servants moved softly, their steps hushed. Inside, the newlyweds were prepared according to custom. For Carlos, a special drink had been made, a thick, spiced potion of honey, herbs, and rare roots, known as the Cup of Strength. He sipped it slowly, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. On the other side of the chamber, Queen Marie-Louise was being freed from her jewels by her maids, her hair loosened, while they gently reminded her that in the royal household, a queen's duty was not simply love. It was to give the realm an heir. In her heart was a strange unease, as though she were being summoned to sit for an examination she had not chosen. That night brought no joyous news. By morning, whispers had begun to spread through the court. Some said the king was too weak. Others murmured that he was incapable altogether. Officially, nothing was said, but unofficially, word traveled swiftly to the great royal houses of Europe. Months passed, yet no infant's cry echoed through the palace halls. The queen's face grew more drawn with each passing day, while Carlos's health worsened further. After every failed attempt, the atmosphere in the court grew heavier. The ambassadors of France and Austria quietly scribbled in their notes, while the powers of Europe watched Spain's future with unblinking attention. This was no longer the failure of a single man. It was the tolling of a bell for an empire, each ring growing louder with the passing of time. Years passed, yet no laughter of an heir ever echoed through the palace halls. The light in Queen Marie-Louise's eyes dimmed, and at only 26 years of age, she died suddenly. The official announcement cited illness, but in the quiet whispers of the court, it was said she had simply grown too weary of living without hope or joy. Carlos grieved, but for the royal advisors, there was no time for mourning. They knew that without an heir, the disintegration of Spain was inevitable. Within months, another marriage was arranged, this time to the German princess Mariana of Neuburg. Her family was famed for its fertility. Her mother had borne 23 children. The court dared to hope that perhaps, this time, fate might be swayed. But fate remained silent once more. No heir came, and Carlos's health deteriorated rapidly. His body withered to bone, his eyes sank deep into their sockets, and rising from bed became an ordeal, let alone walking. In the winter of 1700, the church bells of Madrid rang all at once. Within the royal palace, a final breath was drawn. Carlos II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, was gone at the age of 39. An extraordinary royal autopsy was performed. The physicians wrote in astonishment, his body contained almost no blood. The heart was shriveled to the size of a peppercorn. The lungs were decayed, the intestines rotting, the brain filled with water, and only one atrophied black testicle remained. At the time, it was an unsolved mystery. Today, we know it was the end result of centuries of imprisoning the royal blood within itself. The king's will was opened. Carlos bequeathed the Spanish crown to Philip of Anjou, grandson of King Louis XIV of France. The announcement sent shockwaves through Europe, igniting the flames of the War of the Spanish Succession. But beyond politics, a deeper, quieter truth remained. The purest royal blood of the Habsburg line had proven to be the most fragile of all. Margarita Teresa's scent, which no perfume could mask, and Carlos II's frail body became eternal marks in history. Even now, in the silent corridors of the Escorial Mausoleum in Madrid, where the Habsburg kings lie entombed, a simple marble slab rests over Carlos's grave. Upon it are carved just a few words: El Hechizado, the bewitched king. But in truth, it was no witchcraft. It was the vengeance of time and nature.